The call came at 2:47 in the afternoon. Your father fell, he's at memorial, you should come. Karen drove to the hospital without remembering a single traffic light. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles hurt. Every worst-case scenario lined up in her mind. Surgery, concussion, broken hip. The long, slow decline people whispered about but never named. But the thought that wouldn't leave her alone wasn't the fall itself. It was something quieter, something worse. The uneasy feeling that this hadn't started today, that whatever had happened on her father's kitchen floor had been happening for a long time, and she just hadn't seen it. This is Stories of Connection. Today's story is about the danger of assuming everything is fine with the people we love most. About the moment you realize you stopped really looking at someone, and the signs that were there all along, patient, polite, waiting for you to notice until they stopped waiting. Karen's father had been falling for 6 months before he hit the floor. Not literally. Not the dramatic kind. The other kind. The slow kind. The kind no one calls for help about because it doesn't look like an emergency. I'm Miriam. If you've ever driven to a hospital knowing in your chest that the call should never have surprised you, this one is for you. Let me take you back. Karen's father, Gene, had always been steady. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just reliable. The kind of man who fixed broken cabinet doors without being asked, who shoveled snow before sunrise so no one else had to, who never complained about being tired even when he clearly was. He was 74 now. Still living in the same house he'd bought with Karen's mother, Margaret, in 1976. The kitchen with the avocado green counters they'd always meant to replace. The backyard, Gene, seeded every spring for 43 springs. The garage that smelled like oil and sawdust and the particular metal smell of tools handled for decades. Karen's earliest memories of her father were of following him around that garage on Saturday mornings. She'd sit on an overturned bucket while he rebuilt a carburetor, and he'd hand her bolts to hold, pretending they were important to the job. They weren't. He was teaching her to pay attention. If you ever get lost in a house you've lived in, he used to tell her, it's because you stopped looking. She was 6. She didn't understand what he meant. She remembered it anyway. Gene had worked 36 years at the same manufacturing plant. Foreman by the end, men who'd never said a kind word to anyone at work showed up at his retirement party with stories. One of them cried. Gene shook his hand and told him to stop being ridiculous. He and Margaret had been married 48 years. The kind of marriage where they developed a private language of half sentences and eyebrow raises. Margaret said Gene talked more to her in silences than most men did in conversation. That was who Gene had been. And that was the man Karen still pictured every time she drove over to visit, which she did every few weeks more often when she remembered, less often when life made it hard to remember. There were kids to drive places, deadlines at work, groceries, laundry, emails that multiplied overnight. Nothing unusual, nothing irresponsible, just life. And every time she stopped by, she saw what she expected to see. Her dad. Maybe a little slower, maybe a little quieter. But aging looked like that, didn't it? Everyone slowed down eventually. The problem wasn't what Karen saw. The problem was what Karen was seeing without seeing the way we all stopped seeing the people in our own photographs because we've looked at them so many times. Looking back, Karen would count 10 of them. 10 moments where she had been given the truth and walked past it. Sign 1, the mailbox walk. 6 months before the fall, they'd walk to the mailbox together. A short walk, 80 feet, maybe. Karen slowed her pace without thinking about it. Her father's steps were careful, shorter. His feet were barely lifting from the ground, the way a person walks when they're not quite sure what's under them. She noticed and immediately explained it away. The driveway was uneven. Anyone would be cautious, except her father had never been cautious. He used to stride everywhere, confident, fast, the kind of walking that made you work to keep up. The change hadn't happened suddenly. It had crept in slowly enough to look normal. Sign 2, the pickle jar. 3 months before the fall. Sunday dinner. Gene twisted the lid once, then again, his jaw tightening slightly. Finally, he handed the jar to Karen. These companies make them impossible now, he muttered. Karen opened it easily. She laughed. He laughed. They moved on. But now, sitting in that hospital waiting room, months later, she remembered. It hadn't been the first jar, or the second. His handshake at Christmas had felt softer too. He'd asked her husband to carry the cooler, stopped doing his own yard work. At the time, she'd admired him for being practical, delegating, smart. She never considered another possibility. Strength doesn't disappear all at once. It leaves politely, piece by piece, without announcing anything, sign 3 the weight. Jean had always eaten like a man who worked outdoors his entire life. Big plates. Second helpings. Seconds of the seconds. But at Thanksgiving, he barely finished half. At Christmas, he pushed pot roast around his plate and told Margaret it was delicious. His shirts hung looser, his face sharper. His wedding ring had started sliding on his finger, and Margaret had to remind him to take it in to the jeweler before he lost it. Karen noticed. Once, she said something. "You're looking thin, Dad." "I'm fine," he said. And she let that be the end of the conversation. Because arguing would have felt like accusing him. Because she didn't want to sound dramatic. Because part of her, the part she didn't want to think about, didn't want to know the answer, signed for the handrail that wasn't there. A month before the fall, Karen had dropped by unexpectedly. She'd walked in without knocking something she'd done her entire life, and found Jean standing in the hallway. Not walking, standing, one hand flat against the wall. Just standing there. "Dad?" He startled. "Oh, hey. You okay?" "Fine," he said quickly. "Just thinking." She accepted that answer because it was easier than the other answers. Now, months later, Karen understood what she had interrupted that afternoon. He hadn't been thinking. He had been waiting for the room to stop moving. And she had walked away. And then the Tuesday happened. A neighbor heard the crash at 2:34 in the afternoon. Linda from 2 doors down. She was carrying groceries in from her car when she heard it, the unmistakable sound of a body hitting a floor through an open kitchen window. She called 911 from Jean's porch. She was still on the phone with the dispatcher when Karen's phone rang 13 minutes later. "Your father fell. He's at Memorial. You should come." Here's the part that stayed with Karen for weeks afterward. Linda had been home that afternoon by pure coincidence. She'd left work early because her daughter had a dentist appointment. If the appointment had been on a different day, Linda wouldn't have heard the crash. Jean would have been on that kitchen floor for 3 or 4 hours before Margaret came home from her sister's. That margin, that 13 minutes, that open window, that dentist appointment was the only thing that separated Karen's story from a very different story. If you're watching this and thinking about someone, a parent, a grandparent, someone whose quiet, "I'm fine," has started sounding a little too practiced, pause this video right now and text them. Not tomorrow, right now. I'll be here when you get back. Because the rest of this story isn't about what went wrong. It's about what Karen discovered sitting in a hospital room at 9:47 that night, watching her father's chest rise and fall under a thin blue blanket, and what her mother told her that changed everything. The doctor stopped Karen in the hallway outside Jean's room. He was younger than she'd expected. Kind. The kind of kind that made Karen realize suddenly how tired she was. "Your father was lucky tonight," he said gently. "Falls at his age usually come with warning signs. I'd ask him about the last 6 months carefully." Karen nodded like she understood. She didn't. Not yet. That night, she sat beside Jean's hospital bed while machines hummed softly around them. He slept. His face was softer in sleep than she'd seen it in a long time. His hands, the hands that had built the treehouse, the hands that had walked her down the aisle, the hands that had held her newborn daughter 6 years ago, were resting on the hospital blanket. They looked different tonight. She realized she hadn't really looked at them in years. Margaret came in just after 11. She'd driven from her sister's house, 3 hours each way. She looked smaller than Karen had ever seen her, the way people look smaller after a long car ride done in fear. Karen expected her mother to be shaken, anxious, relieved he was okay. Margaret sat down in the other chair and was quiet for a long time. Then she said the thing that made everything Karen had been telling herself fall apart. "This is the third time, Karen?" Karen looked up. "What? He's fallen before. Twice. Once in the garage. Once getting out of the shower. He made me promise not to tell you." The room went very still. "Mom, why?" "Because he didn't want you to worry. He kept saying he'd handle it. He kept saying he'd tell the doctor next time he went in." "Did he?" Margaret didn't answer. She didn't have to. And here is where Karen's understanding of the last 6 months rearranged itself all at once. Sign 5, the sleeping. Margaret had mentioned it over the phone months ago. Your father isn't sleeping, up half the night. Karen had suggested he talk to his doctor and then forgotten about it. Not intentionally. Just life. She had assumed her mother would handle it. Or the doctor already knew. Or maybe it wasn't serious. It's amazing how comforting assumptions can be. They let you believe someone else is paying attention. Sign 6, the friends. Jean used to organize everything. Coffee with old coworkers, poker nights, phone calls that lasted an hour because he hated getting off the phone. Somewhere along the way that had stopped. Karen had asked once lightly, "You still see the guys?" "Everyone's busy," he'd said. She had told herself he was becoming introverted. People change. Retirement does that. She hadn't thought. Maybe leaving the house has become hard. Maybe exhaustion isn't personality. Maybe independence sometimes hides fear. Later that night, Margaret told her quietly, "They still get together every Thursday. He just doesn't go anymore." Sign 7. Jean had given up driving at night 6 weeks ago without telling anyone. Sign 8. He'd stopped going down to the basement where his woodworking bench was. Margaret had noticed sawdust stop appearing on the kitchen floor. She had assumed he was finishing a project. He wasn't. He hadn't been down there in 2 months. Sign 9. He'd started keeping a flashlight in his pocket. Every day. Even during the day. Sign 10, the one that hurt the most, was the only one Karen had seen with her own eyes and still failed to name. 2 Sundays before the fall, she'd noticed a small black smudge on Jean's cheek. She'd assumed it was grease. She'd handed him a napkin and teased him for looking like a mechanic again. It wasn't grease, it was a bruise. He had fallen the second time the night before. He had pressed frozen peas against his cheek for an hour so it wouldn't show. And Karen, who had been in the kitchen with him for 2 hours that Sunday, had seen it and handed him a napkin. Jean woke up at 7 the next morning. Karen had slept 3 hours in the plastic hospital chair. Her back hurt, her eyes hurt, her heart hurt in a specific place she wasn't sure she'd ever felt before. Jean looked at her and seemed to realize, slowly, where he was. "You shouldn't have slept there," he said. "You have a bad back." "You shouldn't have been on a kitchen floor," she said. "You have a bad balance." He almost smiled. Then he looked away. "How much do you know?" he said quietly. "Mom told me about the other 2. A long silence. "I was going to tell you," he said. "When?" "After it stopped happening." She waited. "I thought if I just paid more attention, I could." He stopped. "I didn't want you to see me like this." "Like what, Dad?" Breakable. That word landed in the room like a stone dropped in water. She felt it ripple through every memory of him she had ever had. Dad. Her voice was quieter than she meant it to be. "You didn't want me to see you breakable. So instead, I could have found out on a phone call." He closed his eyes. "I know. Why didn't you say anything?" He took a long time to answer. "Because the day I tell you I'm not okay," he said, "is the day I become someone you take care of. And I've spent 50 years being the person who takes care of you." She felt her throat close. "That's not how it works, Dad. I know that now." "Do you?" He looked at her. Really looked at her. The way he had looked at her when she was 6 years old and scared of the dark. "I'm your father," he said. "I'm supposed to protect you, not the other way around." "You protected me by teaching me to pay attention," she said. "You told me. If you ever get lost in a house you've lived in, it's because you stopped looking. You said that when I was 6. Do you remember?" He nodded slowly. "I stopped looking," she said. "I stopped looking at you." His eyes were wet. She had seen her father cry exactly twice in her life. Once when his own father died. Once at her wedding. Now was the third. "Dad," she said, "I'm here now. I'm looking now. Don't hide things from me to protect me. Not any more. Please." He reached for her hand. His fingers were thinner than she remembered. "Okay," he said. And that one word after months of fine and it's nothing and I'll handle it was the most important sentence Karen had heard in a year. The doctor said Jean could go home in a few days. Bruised. Sprained wrist. Lucky. Everyone kept saying lucky. Karen didn't feel lucky. She felt late, but not too late. And that mattered more than she could explain. She didn't arrive the next week with lectures or safety brochures. Jean would have thrown her out. Instead, she started visiting more often, not hovering, just staying longer, paying attention. She noticed the porch railing wobble slightly and tightened it while he napped. She refilled light bulbs so rooms stayed bright. She replaced the bathroom bath mat with one that had better grip. She did all of it quietly, without announcing anything, because her father had taught her a long time ago that the most important things are the ones no one thanks you for. She asked questions differently. Not, "How are you?" That always earned fine. Instead, "What did you eat today? How did you sleep last night? When was the last time you saw Dr. Mitchell? Have you been back to the basement? Can I walk with you to the mailbox?" Jean grumbled at first. "I don't need a babysitter." "I know," she said, "but I need my dad. So humor me." He didn't argue after that. On Sundays, she started staying for the afternoon instead of the hour she used to give him. She'd make coffee. He'd sit at the kitchen table and tell her stories. She had never heard stories about his brother who died in Korea. Stories about the night he met Margaret at a church supper when he was 19. Stories about the day Karen was born. And the nurse let him carry her down the hallway. Margaret told Karen later, "He waited his whole life for you to ask." 3 months after the fall, Jean told Karen he was thinking about selling the house. "Too many stairs," he said. "Mom's been telling me for years. She didn't say I told you so. She didn't say finally. She just said, 'What can I do to help?'" He looked at her across the kitchen table, the same table she'd done her homework at, the same table she told him she was getting married at, the same table where the pickle jar had been months ago, and he said, "Just keep coming over." That moment at that kitchen table is what I didn't get with my own mother. I lost my mother 4 years ago. I knew her medications. I knew her doctor's appointments. I knew the brand of tea she liked and where she kept her reading glasses. I didn't know her dreams. I didn't know the name of the boy she loved before she met my father. I didn't know what her favorite memory of her own mother was. I didn't know what scared her at night when she couldn't sleep. I had 36 years to ask. I asked maybe 15 real questions in all of them. That's why I started Saving Family Stories. Not so you don't lose your parent. You will. We all will. That part isn't something anyone gets to prevent. But the distance between what you could know and what you let yourself know, that part is in your hands, right now, this afternoon. Karen's father had been telling her the truth for 6 months. He just wasn't using words. What is your parent telling you right now without using words that you haven't let yourself hear? I made something for you. It's free. It's 50 questions I wish I'd asked my own mother, the kind of questions that don't feel like interrogation, the kind that slip into a Sunday afternoon without making anyone uncomfortable, the kind that have unlocked stories in families who thought they'd heard everything. The link is in the description. Takes 30 seconds. No spam, just the questions, and a short email each Saturday with a new story. If this one meant something to you, subscribe. 1 new story every week. Adult children just like you, learning what they should have been paying attention to all along while their parent is still here to tell them. This is Stories of Connection. Stories about family, about time passing faster than we expect, and about the quiet moments when understanding finally catches up with us. Let's meet again next week for another story. Until then, don't wait.